to dive into the next question, and I think this goes together so seamlessly with these worries that we might have. And it's a question that came in via text, and it says, I claim God's word for peace and not to have fear, but I'm still anxious about what's happening. Does that mean I don't have enough faith? And I think this is something that resonates with all of us. We're all of us that believe in God right now. Just because we believe in God, does that mean we're not afraid? Dr. Holland, is there anything we can find in the Bible that will help us?
Sure. It's very interesting, Kenya. There are a lot of Bible teachers that teach this idea that if we fear, we don't have faith. Well, over 50 times in the Bible, you have the phrase, do not be afraid or fear not. And it's being spoken to people who are serving God. So if God is saying this to someone who is following him, then that must mean that there are people who are of great faith that fear. And I think of two instances, and we could spend an entire show talking about this. But in Joshua 1:9, you have young Joshua, who's now going to be taking over from Moses. Moses, who has led the children of Israel out of Egypt. And God says to Joshua in Joshua 1:9, it's one of my favorite verses in the Bible. He says, do not be afraid. He says, have I not commanded you? Be not afraid. And I think about that for myself. If I was taking over from Moses, of course I would be afraid. I mean, this is a great leader. This is the man that led them out of Egypt. Yeah. And so what does God say to Joshua? He says, he's in essence saying, when he says, do not be afraid, he says, listen, I understand you're afraid, Joshua. I understand this is intimidating. But hey, you don't need to fear me, because the end of that verse says, I will be with you wherever you go. And then I think of Moses. You'll remember the story. Moses and the children of Israel have escaped from Egypt. They have the armies of Pharaoh bearing down on them. And then they have the Red Sea on the other side. And Moses, who has received the message from God, turns to the children of Israel and he says, and sometimes we miss the humor of the Bible. He says, do not be afraid. And I think of myself, if I was standing there and Pharaoh and his armies are coming, and there's water on the other side, and he says, do not be afraid. But then what's the next thing he says? He says, stand still. And Ruben, you just mentioned this a moment ago, this idea of spending time with God, understanding where God is. And then he says, and see the salvation of the Lord, and he will accomplish, and what he will accomplish for you today. And so it's this whole idea that, is it normal to be afraid? Of course. And are we sinning if we're afraid? Absolutely not. But God comes and draws up next to us and says, listen, I understand you're afraid, but I'm going to walk with you during these times. I'm going to take you hand in hand. I'm going to take you by the hand. And I'm not necessarily going to pull you out of the trial. I'm not going to pull you out of the tribulation you're facing, but I'm going to hold you hand by hand, and we're going to walk through it together, because I'm going to be with you wherever you go.
Amen.